I'm Zim, and you're listening to the Helpful Photographer Podcast in collaboration with New York City Photo Safari. To register for a safari, please visit newyorkcityphotosafari.com. This is the second of a three-part series on macro photography. When it comes to macro photography, the biggest problems revolve around focus, both with blurry photos and choosing where to put the focus. First, not getting focus at all. You need to understand that every lens has a minimum focusing distance. The minimum focusing distance is the closest you can place an object in front of your lens and still hold focus. This can be anywhere from a few inches to a few feet, depending on your lens. If you're using single-shot autofocus and you're closer than that distance, you'll find that the camera will refuse to fire, because in autofocus, the camera will not fire unless it detects something in focus. You will also often find that the camera will refuse to focus on the flower you're attempting to photograph, but the blade of grass just beneath the flower looks great. This happens for two reasons. The blade of grass is likely further than the minimum focusing distance, while the subject, the flower, is closer than the minimum focusing distance. The other reason is that often flowers lack the contrast and texture that the sensor needs in order to achieve focus, and so the camera is having a hard time focusing. If you're using the budget alternative to the macro lens, which I went over in the previous podcast, you'll find that there's actually a maximum focusing distance as well. Whereas an actual macro lens will allow you to focus on the minimum focusing distance to infinity, the budget alternative will only allow you to focus anywhere between 1 and 10 inches, meaning that if the subject is further than the maximum, you'll never get focus. That's why I said in the previous podcast that there's no infinity focus with these options. Okay, so let's say you're further than the minimum focusing distance, and the camera is actually focusing, but the depth of field is really rather shallow, so that only a tiny portion of the subject is actually in focus. The shallow depth of field is actually a really common problem, and this is because you are so close to the object. Remember, the closer you are to the object, the shallower the depth of field, which makes hitting focus even harder. To create more depth of field, you'll need to close down your aperture, do some focus stacking, or move back away from your subject and crop the image in post-process. The problem with closing down your aperture is that you often don't have enough light to do this, and it's either going to force your ISO up, reducing resolution, or slowing down your shutter speed, which may cause motion blur. And of course, backing away from your subject and cropping also means that you'll lose some resolution depending on your camera. As for focus stacking, this is great, especially if you're shooting in a controlled studio environment. But let's face it, most of us like to be outside shooting flowers, which are often subject to the wind, which will make focus stacking nearly impossible. Another problem that many macro photographers face is motion blur. Like I just said, many of us like to be shooting outside. As a result of this, you'll find that the slightest breeze will not only push your flower out of focus, but create motion. In this case, you need to speed up your shutter speed to stop that motion, but the consequence of that is a wider aperture. The hurdle that I've been trying to get over lately is having enough light to deal with the fast shutter speed in combination with a smaller aperture opening. The result is increased ISO. One way around this is to simply introduce more light in the form of a flash. The flash will effectively stop the motion of moving objects. Adding a flash could be a great way to add some interest to your images as well. But that's a completely different conversation, which I'll leave to the next podcast. Now that you know how to get more focus, the question is, where should you focus? Because the depth of field is so shallow, you need to be more decisive about what you focus on. To that end, you'll probably want to be using a smaller autofocus area and force the camera to disregard everything else. By the way, should, quote-unquote, should, is a strong word. And the answer to what, quote-unquote, should you focus on is actually rather subjective. In my opinion, you should focus on what you want the viewer to pay attention to. That's it. The hard part is making that decision and knowing what you want. Unfortunately, I won't be able to advise you on that. And maybe a discussion with your therapist on what you want might help. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Until next time, keep on shooting.